Started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Carol Watts, and I am the Vice President of the League of Women Voters of San Jose, Santa Clara. This is the first Lunch with League that we've held since our annual meeting in June. And Diane McNutt and Taryn Upchurch have been elected to be your co-presidents coming up in for the next year. Diane planned to welcome you today, but she had a conflicting personal situation that came up a few days ago, so I am going to be your host again. The purpose of the League of Women Voters, which serves San Jose, Santa Clara, Milpitas, Morgan Hill, and Gilroy, is to encourage informed and active participation in government, and we influence public policy through education and advocacy. We do not support or oppose any political party or candidate. Each month, we host a speaker who can share with us information and ideas that will help broaden our understanding of issues in our community. This month, we are pleased to welcome Ian Griffiths of Seamless Bay Area, an organization that seeks to reduce air pollution and traffic congestion by creating a world-class transit system throughout the Bay Area that would integrate the region's 27 transit agencies into one easy-to-use system. Now, that is a goal I'd love to see made. Ian has worked as an urban and transportation planner for the past 14 years in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors. Before joining Seamless Bay Area as its policy director, he worked at BART, leading long-range planning projects. He is the author of Governing Transit Seamlessly, Option for a Bay Area Transportation Network Manager. After his initial presentation, we'll have time for questions as usual, so please send them through chat as they occur to you. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ian Griffiths. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol, so much for having me and to the League. I'm really pleased to be here today and pleased with some of the actions that League has already taken to support this work, this vision of an integrated, rider-friendly, and ultimately higher ridership transit system. So I've got some slides to share, and we think we should have plenty of time to do questions. If you can keep those in mind for the end. Again, I am Seamless Bay Area's policy director, and Seamless Bay Area is a nonprofit whose mission is to create a world-class integrated public transit system across our region by both building a diverse movement for change from the grassroots up, as well as developing and promoting the actual policy and legislative reforms that can get us there. Part of that vision of an integrated system is coordinated fares, service schedules, branding to make transit easy to use, more service overall, which requires additional funding for public transit, but importantly, a set of governance reforms that can unify our 27 transit agencies into a user-centered network. Why is this important? I mean, many of you are probably aware of how central public transportation is to so many of our region's challenges, from the housing affordability challenges. The more transportation you have, the more public transportation you have, the more housing options you have, the more access to, in this increasingly expensive region, affordable housing options you have. Obviously, it's connected to our traffic levels of congestion. Transportation is a biggest source of emissions, both within California, as well as I understand within Santa Clara County, as well as our inequality challenges as a region, and who has access to opportunity and who does not. We do a lot of, talking to average members of the public, and what we hear over and over again is people want to use public transit, but they so often don't because it is just too difficult. It doesn't make sense for them. It doesn't necessarily take them where they want to go, and that they would use it more, but it just needs to be more reliable, frequent, and dependable. Even before COVID, we saw transit use going down. The chart on the left indicates that, we were not on a good trajectory even prior to COVID, and COVID has really created a whole new set of challenges that is causing a threat to the very future of even our very basic public transportation system here in the Bay Area. Only about 5 or 6% of all trips in the Bay Area are taken on public transit in comparison to about 75% of trips that are taken in private vehicles. And a core challenge here, is of course this fragmentation. We lead regional lives. So many of our trips, in vehicles, cross boundaries of cities, boundaries of transit agencies, but our transit agencies don't. The way we run transit doesn't reflect people's needs. There's separate fares, schedules, routes, maps, as well as when we think about the long-range planning, a lot of the really expensive components of transit, we are not planning long-range in a coordinated way. We're not even investing in the overall future system that will create a greater level of connectivity. I think I made this point already, but to address our climate challenges, there's a number of things we need to do to reduce our emissions from transportation, but significantly increasing the percentage of trips that are taken on transit from that approximately 6% to much higher share overall. Some of our state plans indicate we want to get to about 20% of overall trips on transit, and also increasing, biking and walking as well by similar proportions. That's all essential, in addition to electrifying our cars, doing the other things, even within the auto trips that can reduce emissions. All of those strategies are needed to get to the level of reduction of greenhouse gas emissions and vehicle miles traveled ultimately that we're seeking to achieve. So our vision, one of the things we've done is put out a clear vision for change that we hope inspires average members of the public to get involved and to call for this type of change. We developed, this map of what we think a seamless system would look like, what our transit system would look like if we actually planned it as an integrated system, putting all of our systems on one map and thinking about how we can maximize connectivity. Our vision of a seamless system is one that is actually planned at a regional scale to work as a system, very intentionally to work as a system, where transit agencies, and there may continue to be many of them, will work together to operate service seamlessly so that riders aren't aware of all the barriers. And this is possible. Without necessarily even merging agencies, which some people assume is that our policy prescription. There are ways of doing it without necessarily merging agencies, but it does require that we put the customer first. And certain aspects of the transit system do need to be standardized, from fare policies to schedule coordination, wayfinding and signage. These need to be functions that are done at a regional scale and not on an agency by agency scale. And that requires governance reforms. We also need more, as I mentioned, more funding overall to just increase the frequency of service, ensure that trains and buses and ferries can come more often. And that is a significant part of making the transit system more attractive, in addition to all of the things that we can do to make it more seamless. So the key governance reform that we have done a lot of advocacy on is the creation of a transportation network manager authority, basically a region-wide entity that has a clear accountability and mandate to oversee the entire transit system and pursue integration. We don't have this right now. We have a number of regional institutions that don't really completely do any of these things. So this is a governance structure that exists in different forms in different parts of the world that have different that have higher rates of transit use, from Frankfurt to Toronto to Seattle to Vancouver, to name a few North American as well as international examples. The key common features of a transportation network manager is that oversees a common set of functions on behalf of the entire on behalf of all transit agencies in the region, including long-range planning, fare policy, service standards, branding, data, these key functions that really shouldn't be different from agency to agency. And that entity can coexist with a number of different independent local operators, but that have a just more limited set of responsibilities on operations, deploying fleets, local service. These two things can coexist and deliver a seamlessly integrated network for riders. And importantly for the Bay Area, they can exist in an environment where we have a lot of different local funding sources. So the reason why the Bay Area is so fragmented is because it's how we fund transit as well, so often at a county-wide level with individual county-level ballot measures or special districts. So that is not an impediment to us achieving this more integrated system. It does pose an additional challenge, though. So that's our vision of where we want to get to, and those are some of the key policy reforms that we seek to achieve. Now we'll talk about some of the progress we've made toward this since we got started as a nonprofit in 2018, which is not that long ago, although we are building on efforts that I think many advocacy groups have been working on for a very long time. So one of the key things that we have done is really tried to build a very broad-based coalition and movement of riders calling for change. And this has been something that we have observed as we interviewed people who had tried to take on this issue in the past. We found this was something that was oftentimes missing, where the public, the riders, really need to have this as a central call for change in order for it to happen. So we published something called the Seamless Transit Principles to really guide to be something that is very easy for people to understand, that focuses on the outcomes that we think the average member of the public wants to see in their public transit system, like run all Bay Area transit as one easy-to-use system, put riders first, make it equitable and accessible to all, align prices, connect with other forms of transportation. So these principles we published a number of years ago, and we now have 74 nonprofit and business groups that have supported it, and the League is I think our most recent supporter. So we really are grateful for I think it was the Bay Area League that chose to join this. In support of the Seamless Transit Principles. We have groups from the business community, environmental community, equity-focused groups, housing groups from all parts of the region, disability groups. So this is really showing that this is not a controversial issue. This is an issue that helps everyone, and that everyone is in support of changing. And we've also used it as a way of building political support, particularly among many of the locally elected officials, who some people perceive to be the opposite people who oppose this type of change. But we believe that locally elected officials do also want to see these changes, even if it affects, perhaps their level of autonomy within the individual boards that they sit on. So we've had now over 20 cities and counties adopt the Seamless Transit Principles, and 3 transit agencies, including the BART board and most recently the VTA board. So this has been an important, and that's been an important part of, the momentum that we have developed at a political level to move these issues forward, because people see it as very much in alignment of what the public wants. There's also been some really promising public polling in this area. So MTC finally did some polling around this, and found that 89% of Bay Area residents, which is an incredibly high number. It's hard to get 89% of people in the Bay Area to agree on anything, but 89% of people in the Bay Area support a seamless transit system. And this polling was done with regard to a bill that we were working on last year that ended up not moving forward, but we see it, across all parts of the region, across, current riders, as well as people who don't even take transit, strongly support, don't see this issue as at all something that they're concerned about, and want to see move forward. So we've built a lot of public support. We've also made some incremental steps in working with our regional institutions, transit agencies locally, and MTC in advancing fare integration specifically. So this is the idea of making the fare structures of all of our 27 agencies at least make sense and be coordinated to be able to attract more people to the system. So we fought very hard for the study for the region to complete a fare integration study, which wrapped up late last year. And the result of that study was, for the first time, recommendations to introduce 3 key policies in our region that can build ridership and reduce barriers between transit agencies. So one is creating multi-agency passes. Basically, you can't buy a pass for a month on transit that's good on more than one agency. You can buy a VTA pass, you can buy a Caltrain pass, but for the first time, as a result of this study, they're recommending creating a multi-agency pass that gives you all the transit you want to use for one set price. And this has been something they think will increase ridership. It's being piloted starting this September with educational institutions like UC Berkeley and San Jose State University, as well as some housing groups. And as well, it's going to be piloted with large employers early next year. But the goal of these pilots is, if it works, if this strategy helps increase ridership, it will form the basis to be able to fund making this pass available to any member of the public in the future. The study also recommended free transfers between agencies, which they estimated could bring 25,000 new transit riders to the system a day by virtue of doing that, and setting up a regional standard fare structure for the long distance services. So getting BART, Caltrain, the ferries, express buses to all adopt a common fare structure. This policy change was the most impactful. It was estimated to increase 68,000 new transit trips a day, which is the equivalent of adding a whole new Caltrain's worth of riders to the Bay Area's transit system. So really significant increases in transit use that we can achieve through these really basic reforms, but which are still incredibly difficult to achieve without governance changes. So even though there's consensus on these issues, it's very, very slow to implement these reforms because of our very fragmented structure. So this leads me to the final area I wanted to touch on, which is our progress in building the political leadership to actually introduce some of these policy changes and including the things that do require legislation to make these seamless policies happen, and ultimately what we think is necessary to build the public support to get more funding for these things. So we've been working on legislation since 2020 with Assemblymember David Chu on a couple of bills that really, created neither bill actually ended up moving forward. But in 2020, it was cut short due to the COVID pandemic, but they did lay really what it showed was that there was a lot of support for these things. And the 2020 bill in particular led to the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force, which is the task force that the region set up in the wake of COVID to bring together community groups like us and Spur and Bay Area Council and Transform, elected leaders and transit agency leaders to develop a long-term plan for the transformation of our region. So where we are right now, the legislative effort that I'll talk about in a moment is SB 917. It's called the Seamless Transit Transformation Act. But we've really created a lot of momentum in Sacramento and locally for the legislative steps that are part of making this change. So that the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force has been a really important initiative that was largely, I think, in response to the success and the interest in the state legislation we advanced in 2020. It brought together our region's leaders to develop this vision. And for the first time, we as a region adopted a vision of a unified system. We set that as our ultimate goal. It identified 27 actions we could take over the next several years to advance different components of a unified system, including integrated fares, as the other study was pointing to, but also integrated branding and wayfinding, integrated service, improving accessibility, in particular for people with disabilities who have an especially fragmented experience of using transit, as well as going after and getting that funding that is needed for transformation at a region-wide scale, not necessarily on that individual local scale. And on the governance reform issue, specifically creating that network manager that we think is so essential, that we see in the research is a fundamental component of these high-performing systems in other places. What's underway now is that was recommended out of that Blue Ribbon Task Force is something called the Network Management Business Case, which is essentially a study looking at what are the different governance structures that we, as the Bay Area, could pursue that would allow us to meet our objectives as far as a much higher ridership system that is unified and user-focused and ultimately helps us reduce our emissions from transportation. So now SB 917, just a little bit more information about the current legislative proposal that is making its way through the Assembly. So this is authored by Senator Josh Becker of both northern, I guess, Mountain View in the Santa Clara region, I believe Mountain View, Sunnyvale, but also much of San Mateo County. It's co-sponsored by us as well as Bay Area Council Transform, Silicon Valley Leadership Group, Joint Venture Silicon Valley, and it has a number of different co-authors from across the Bay Area. And what it does is it basically sets near-term deadlines for the MTC and the regional transit agencies to deliver on that transformation action plan, some of those key initiatives that we agreed to in a public meeting, but really there is no, like we have a record in the Bay Area of setting ambitious goals or setting deadlines and then really not meeting them. So this sets clear deadlines for an integrated fare structure, for wayfinding standards for transit across all of our agencies, for common standards for real-time information. So basically ensuring that each transit agency publishes arrival data in the common format such that it's available universally. So you can always know, no matter what part of the Bay Area you are in, you can always have accurate arrival information for when the next vehicle is coming. And then a deadline for completing something that's called the Connected Networks Plan. So this is a plan of integrated service, which we have never actually done before, but which is a fundamental part of actually, making the case for more funding. So it sets deadlines for these 4 different components of the Transformation Action Plan. And what it does is it says, these are not only deadlines, but all the agencies must comply with these policies in order to receive the funding that ultimately MTC allocates to each of the agencies. So it becomes a requirement. You're not allowed to opt out of these standards if you're receiving state funding, a particular source of funding called STA funding that MTC has discretion over. MTC is our regional transportation authority that currently is the only really 9-county fully regional transportation authority, but it has a limited set of powers right now. So this would strengthen its ability to oversee integration in the near term. So how does this fit into, finally, I'm almost done here, and then we'll go to questions, but I'll finish here with a sense of how this plays into a longer term strategy, because SB 917 is an important step, but it is not going to resolve all of the issues and all of the reforms that we need to ultimately create that seamless transit system. So looking at the next several years here and what we hope to turn our attention to next after we hope SB 917 passes. So we have this timeline here. You can see, our work is across these 3 areas. The first row is the actions associated with implementing this transformation action plan. We have work associated with setting up a network manager, that governance reform that we need to have in order to oversee, a much more functional system going forward. And then also a separate stream of work on funding. So the white boxes are the different studies that have either already been completed in our region or that are currently underway. We're done with the fare integration study and the Blue Ribbon Task Force. And SB 917, these blue boxes are the different legislative steps that we're advancing. So this is happening in 2022. And that will lead to some clear deadlines for us implementing different components of integration, real-time data standards by 2023, integrated fare structure policies by 2024, and wayfinding standards by 2025. That's what the bill will do. But then what coming up in 2023 and 2024 are a number of really important reforms So building off of once this business case for network management is completed, basically the governance study, we know that there's going to need to be some legislative reforms to actually set up or designate that network manager within the Bay Area. Someone needs to have that responsibility. So we hope that will happen in 2023. It's possible it may happen in 2024. We also see additional steps around other reforms related to regional rail, as well as project delivery, basically how quickly we build and construct projects, how we can build more with fewer resources. We see other potential legislative steps being valuable within 2023 or 2024 there. And then on the funding side, we're very pleased. We know that we need more funding overall, especially for operations, to just run more service. This is a critical part of these changes, and it's also a critical part of funding some of the components of integration. In particular, integrated fares does require some amount of new money to make happen, to fund those free transfers, to fund some of the policies that will reduce the friction between different agencies. So we're very pleased that MTC is now advancing authorizing legislation. They're planning to pursue authorizing legislation in 2023 that would give them the authority to put something on the ballot as early as 2024 to ask voters for funding, and some kind of new revenue source that can fund different components of our transit system and help us recover ridership from pre-COVID levels, but also significantly add more service and build out some of the projects that are needed to have a more connected network. So there's some outreach and engagement going on right now, like starting now, and then it's depending on what year looks like the right year to go after this, we will be positioned to put something on the ballot as early as 2024, possibly later. So those are the different things that we're expecting to occur, or we would like to occur. We're working very hard in coalition with so many groups to make happen. So this is my last slide here. How can the League of Women Voters help? You've already helped in a number of ways. So I'll just call out 5 things here, 5 opportunities. So one is just sign up for our mailing list if you're not already on it. We don't send out a lot of emails, but what we do highlight opportunities to actually speak up when it's important. And speaking up not only at the state legislature, but at your local transit agencies. VTA in particular is an agency that we really need as many people as possible who live in the VTA service area, who use VTA, to express how important these changes are. So I would say VTA has been one of the more reluctant agencies to embrace these opportunities. So if you are signed up for our mailing list, we'll alert you to opportunities to speak up at VTA and other agencies, depending on where you live, as well as just keep you informed as to what's going on. So that's just very easy to do on our website, seamlessbayarea.org. You've already adopted the Seamless Transit Principles, so thank you. If you're part of other groups, other community groups that haven't adopted the principles, you can check out the list on seamlesstransitprinciples.org or on our website. You should be able to find it pretty easily. And if you see a group that you're part of that hasn't endorsed them, please get in touch with me. You can email me at ian@seamlessbayarea.org, or you can actually just, the instructions are all on the website if you want to endorse them. There's just a very simple form and the materials that you would need to bring to your board or community group to get them to sign off on it. So you can even do that without contacting me, but you're welcome to contact me if you'd like a presentation or more information about those principles. Obviously, support letters for SB 917. I think the League is already working on that, so thank you so much. Okay, the last 2 things here are on the funding. If you are interested in, or the League is interested in getting more involved in working on more funding for public transportation, we have an opportunity. We're part of a coalition of groups called Voices for Public Transportation, which is a coalition of over 50 groups that has been meeting for the past couple of years to advance steps on a regional funding measure. And the success, the victory that I was citing about MTC finally moving this forward is very much related to the efforts of Voices for Public Transportation. So we are trying to expand this coalition, and actually our next meeting is one that specifically we're trying to get new groups who have never attended before to just learn about what's been going on. So August 11th at 5 p.m. is an opportunity to just tune in and hear what Voices for Public Transportation is, and you can decide whether you want to get more involved or just stay on their list. But I can send you an invite for that if you are interested in joining that. And then finally, if you are in a position to make a contribution to Seamless Bay Area, we are a charity. We have a both 501c3 and a 501c4 arm. We do both political activities as well as charitable, non-political activities. So that's another way you can support our work, or put us in touch with folks who you think might be more interested in supporting this work if you're familiar with folks who might be interested. So that's all I have to say. Thanks. I'll turn it back over to our moderator, our host. We can do some questions or open it up to the public, to the audience.
Yes, thank you, Ian. That was a great overview, and I know I've got some questions. We'll now open the program for questions, and I'd like to introduce Roma Dawson, who is a member of our local League of Board of Directors, and she also serves as president of the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area. And she will ask the questions that you want. So continue to send them in on chat. Or if you would like to ask the question yourself, you can click on the raise hand symbol, and then we can call on you and you can ask it yourself. So Roma, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Carol. And Ian, we're so glad to have you here in San Jose area and in Santa Clara County, because you are well aware of the challenges that we face here with VTA, which has low ridership compared to many of the other agencies, and we're challenged in funding. And just to give you an example, I have been a commissioner in the city of San Jose for many years. I live in West San Jose. I often try to look at buses and see how I can get to downtown San Jose. And what is about a 15-minute drive normally and can take up to an hour to commute is almost a 2-hour bus ride. And if my meeting goes over, I can't get back. So one of the things, full disclosure to everybody listening, I was asked to write up the legislative analysis for SB 917, along with another board member from League Bay Area. So the state league has now officially supported SB 917. So again, League Bay Area will be encouraging its members to engage individually as well. And thank you for making the point about climate change. We have Judy Chamberlain with us, who is co-chair of our very active climate change committee. So this is something of profound importance. And I'm going to reverse the order of questions a little bit. And again, folks, please do enter questions into chat. On your website, you do have a link to Voices for Public Transportation, and my portfolio is in the League Bay Area is social policy, and specifically affordable housing and homelessness issues. And I know we are following what's called the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, a committee out of ABAG and MTC. I know they just took action. So could you talk a little bit more about where the rubber's going to meet the road in terms of funding to make all this wonderful goals actually happen? And maybe give us some insight into what you're looking at. For example, will it be an integrated? I realize you don't have answers yet because this is the beginning of the stakeholder process, but I'm hoping to get League folks interested in following what might be a regional measure that might integrate transportation and housing funding, or it might not. So could you just talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So yes, I'm aware, and certainly Voices, the group that I was referring to, Voices for Public Transportation, is following closely, and in many cases, many of the groups are also working on advancing a housing measure or funding for housing, and is supportive of the the work of the Finance Authority. So the two issues are, of course, linked. We do need more housing and transportation, or like peanut butter and chocolate. They go well together. You need to have a highly performing transportation system if you want the housing that you build to not have to not be completely auto dependent, and vice versa. So what the Voices' efforts have been focused on, where the housing, the movement for housing funding is ahead, and what they've done very well is they have the enabling legislation already that's been passed. So they're really well positioned to go and put something on the ballot when the polling looks right, when the time is right, and that's what they're focusing on now. And they think 2024 is that opportunity. On the transportation side, we don't have the enabling legislation. We have not done that homework. So that's really where Voices really feels like 2023 is the time to advance. What is the vision that we want to go to voters with? What are the set of priorities we need? What are the financing sources? We haven't actually, the revenue sources were identified for the housing measure. There's the legislation authorizes, actually a list of different possible sources, but we don't have that clarity on the transportation side. So we're focusing on that step of the authorizing legislation, and with the ultimate decision around, well, what's the right year to put it on the ballot? Is it going to be 2024? Should it be a measure that combines housing and transportation in one measure? Should there be two measures on the same election year? We can't predict the future, and we're certainly we're not going to go after something that doesn't seem winnable, but the prerequisite for all of that is having the enabling legislation that gives us the most number of options to be able to, as the dates get closer, kind of make the call as to, okay, what should move forward in 2024? And ultimately, we know we need both. Like within the next number of years, we know we need more funding for transportation and housing, but let's give ourselves the tools to be able to be strategic about that decision, and not just sort of end up not pursuing transportation because, I think we know that the other urgent issue around transportation that I didn't mention was that the various transit agencies across the regions are in a huge financial crisis right now that has been staved off because of federal emergency relief money. There's 3 COVID relief bills have given transit agencies additional operating money that will carry many of them through 2024, perhaps 2025. But that money is going to run out, and the ridership declines have been so severe that if we do not come up with a new source of funding, and it could be a regional measure, it could be some state source, there could be other sources coming down. But but if we don't identify something, there's going to be drastic service cuts in many parts of the Bay Area, much more drastic than what we've seen to date. I know there have been service cuts in many parts of the region. So again, this is giving us the tools to be able to proactively prevent that with a regional measure if there hasn't been some state source or some federal additional source that has been authorized, and we want to be able to have that ability.
I've had a question come in through chat from Marie Ann Shovelin, who's actually on the League Bay Area board with me. She's a member of Cupertino-Sunnyvale League, local league. And she mentions that the timing for completion of these projects is so far out, 2024, that there could be a big issue with attention to the effort. Are there interim projects that can help fill the gaps in 2022, 2023 to keep people activated?
Yeah, well, definitely from activating, groups such as yourselves or groups across the region. I mean, there's going to be a lot of opportunities in 2022 and 2023 to kind of advance these initiatives. So while many of them don't take effect for some time, I mean, SB 917 is a current effort. I do think in 2023 we're going to have legislation, other pieces of legislation that will, I hope, activate and excite people because they will advance. You know, authorizing legislation for a funding measure, I hope is something that we can communicate as something that will substantively increase, improve transit access. So I think those are the legislative efforts, you know, that I highlighted on that timeline, and those are happening in 2023. A lot of them are. In terms of the actual policies that people experience, I mean, we are those pilots for integrated fares. Those are the higher education pilots are starting this fall in 2022. So that's something that we've already been successful in getting funding for. So tens of thousands of university students and people who live in some affordable housing developments will begin to actually experience, a greater freedom of traveling where they can use all of the transit systems for one set fare. So some of that data can help build the support for, you know, funding these at a greater scale. And then I feel like I was going to mention one other thing. I think the fare integration piece is in particular where we see the opportunity to advance incremental pilots like that over the next couple of years, but starting really with in 2022, the multi-agency pass pilots, and then we hope we can take it to the next step in 2023 with free transfers. So there's a launch of the new Clipper system. So Clipper is our region-wide fare card that is on most of our transit agencies. And in 2023, what's happening is they're upgrading to a new technology. And their MTC is currently planning to introduce the policy of free transfers between agencies within that 2023 launch of Clipper. Our legislation sets an absolute deadline of 2024 for that, but we actually expect it to happen sooner than that. So the legislation is kind of just it's setting an absolute deadline, but we think that in 2023 that can also really help give people a sense of how much better transit could be, because if you take Caltrain to a VTA bus, obviously the impact of free transfers is basically your bus connecting bus is free. Or if you're going the opposite way, if you're going from a VTA bus to Caltrain to a Muni bus, your total fare will just be the cost of Caltrain. You'll get a credit for that. You'll pay your VTA fare, but then your Caltrain fare will be adjusted to basically only charge you the extra amount for the Caltrain fare, rather than, you'll get a $250 credit, and then your Muni trip at the end of that trip will be free because it's a free transfer as well. So those are some upcoming things that we're really excited about and that we'll definitely be promoting to keep people excited and supportive of taking the next steps.
Well, I hope you'll stay in touch with League of Women Voters Bay Area, and we do have something called Monitor that we send out so we can help you get the word out as these kind of benchmarks come up. And I want to go back to the Blue Ribbon Transit Recovery Task Force, because it was kind of, I thought, a rather amazing collaborative 10-month-long process where you address short-term emergency needs. You were a key member of that group. Just to let folks know, our area was well represented. It included Supervisor Cindy Chavez as a member of MTC, and our state senator, Dave Cortese, who succeeded State Senator Jim Bell prior. So, and also we had another local member that out of the Policy Advisory Committee. So our area was well represented. And you mentioned, I'm so glad you have the slide where you talked about 27 action items that were very specific, with a very specific timeline. And you put some of that up. I think one of the things I'm wondering about is, has MTC met some of those deadlines? They were supposed to hear a status update, I believe, in the beginning of this year. I mean, how is that work moving along? Is it progressing? It
is progressing. yes, it is progressing. There is a lot of interest still, I think, among the commission, the 21 commissioners who sit on MTC. There have also been some snags and delays, and I think this is why legislation is important. It's sort of, plans are great, but of course, we're always very optimistic when we create these plans, and it's easy to develop a long list of things. It's harder to follow through with them. So, there have been some disappointments from our perspective, like many of the deadlines that were put in the plan have already, like within a few months, like we were hearing, oh, well, no, that deadline is no longer valid. Like we should have never put that deadline in. We're not going to get that done by 2024. Like the deadlines for wayfinding standards were called out as being complete by 2024, and we've since learned that that's not going to be possible till 2025. So that's why our bill doesn't. We initially tried to keep the bill consistent with the commitments that were made, but we do want to work with the staff. We know we can't do the impossible here, so we're understanding of some of these changes. But I think it also, another example is this network management study, that I was referring to. It has already slipped in terms of the timeline. It was supposed to be completed by this fall. We're now hearing it's going to be extended till February, which kind of butts up against our legislative calendar. Things get pushed from year to year to year. So there's a lot of good work. There's a lot of smart people working on it. I think the difficulty in implementing it really highlights how we need to address the overarching question of what entity is accountable at the end of the day for moving this forward. And we need something new. We need a revised, much more streamlined approach to moving these initiatives forward, because it is unwieldy to have even MTC and 27 transit agencies trying to, through consensus, move things forward. Trying to get 27 people to do anything is extremely difficult. So good pros and cons. We're just trying to keep it in the forefront of the public mind. But also we know that the plan is not going to save us. Just because we have a plan does not mean the work is done.
Well, I'm disappointed about the wayfaring. I thought that was one of the easier goals, and you're telling me even that's going to be delayed at least a year, it sounds like. We've had a question come in that's very specific, and I think it relates to wayfaring and how complicated it is to do trip planning. I've tried to use the MTC trip planner. Do you have any practical advice for folks on an app to use if we're trying to navigate around the Bay Area on mass transit?
This is not an official seamless position. This is my personal experience. I find Google the easiest to use, as well as I use Google Maps, and usually accurate, not always, but easier than I think any of the apps that are put out by our public agencies. I find Google to just provide the full suite of options. But the other thing that I use is an app called Trip, which you can download. It's literally called Transit App. And what you can do trip planning with that, but what I find especially helpful is it's really easy to get the real-time information super easily. So it detects where you are. If you're standing on a corner and basically you're wondering when is my bus coming, or what buses could I get on from here, they'll all pop up super quickly. And so I use those two things primarily.
Well, to go back to SB 917 and future needs, I know the bill's been amended significantly, and in researching the bill, I read an interesting quote which called our 27 agencies in the Bay Area a discombobulated mess, which I would agree with quite strongly. And we've gotten questions. I know we're starting to get a little short on time. What are the barriers to progress? What's going to impede you? Is it political entities, certain organizations? Is the big thing the funding? I know that was what was kind of vetted out of SB 917. Could you talk just a little bit, help us understand league? We advocate as league, but also we have a lot of league members that like to advocate individually as individuals.
No, thanks for that question. So funding is really important. I think that is a barrier. And so we have been advocating through the state budget process to get more funding for transportation and particularly for operations, because like funding the fare integration, a lot of the things that are within, the suite of things that we want to support are ultimately, there's often a lot of money for capital projects like new shiny extensions of things. And the state budget actually recently came out with a whole bunch of, types of those projects, but still very little in the way of funding that could be used for integrated fares or wayfinding. So yes, trying to, through the state, through federal advocacy, through regional advocacy and local advocacy, getting the funding and having that funding be able to fund some of these regional initiatives is a key piece. And so that's one thing. However, there's really interesting, there aren't really any civic groups that are in opposition. So if you look at, as I say, all across all sectors, business, environment, there's very broad support for SB 917 and for seamlessness. Where we find the biggest opposition is often among transit agency staff and among some elected officials at a local level, but actually not necessarily even the majority. It's like a select few. That's where we've really worked hard to try to build those relationships, but there is really a fear of change here, and change is hard. And so this is where we think, riders coming out and speaking up in support and making this an election issue so that people who get elected to these boards really, they're championing these policies from the moment they're running for these offices. I think it's a really important question to ask potential candidates who sit on boards how they feel about this policy and if they're, if they support it or if they have questions about it, what is leading to those questions that they have about it. So we're seeing a turnover in some elected leaders that we're seeing much more supportive members of boards, like the BART board is extremely supportive of this. We're seeing more and more candidates, and we'd like to see more of that to help overcome those barriers and some of the staff reluctance to embrace change, because it's not the way they're used to doing things.
Well, thank you for that advice. And while we're absolutely nonpartisan for over 100 years, never support a party or a person, we do run a lot of candidate forums where we screen questions. So I think that's something for league folks to think about. Are we asking these tough questions? And league, it's extremely important to league to advance equity. And I know that equity is a big part of your work, including working with Center for Independent Living, I believe it's called. I know Adina on your staff is a real leader in this area, and also does a lot of work with affordable housing groups, social justice groups. I mean, your networking is incredibly impressive. Could you talk just a little bit one thing that really got me was when I saw it's called the Transit Center out of New York City. I'd never heard of it, but it put out something about inequity and transit in the Bay Area, affecting things like access to medical care. And I just thought, wow, this is a fact sheet we need to get out. Could you talk just a little bit about equity in your organization, equity in the Blue Ribbon Task Force, and how important this is to the fundamental principles of equity to help those of us that are income challenged in the Bay Area?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, existing transit riders are about 50% of them could be characterized as low income, I think at the $50,000 income threshold. So it's, transit should be for everyone, but in reality, the people who are most dependent on it are people with limited incomes. which makes sense. I mean, they don't necessarily have the access to, having enough, one or more private vehicles to be able to use. Car ownership is expensive. And as a result, they're suffering. Low-income people in particular suffer the consequences of a very fragmented network. There's data that indicates that people the more transfers you make, the more likely you are to be low income, because you don't have a choice. You've got to put up with that inconvenience because you have no other choice. So policies that create free transfers, policies that make those things more seamless, they are benefiting, disproportionately. They're good for the people who are, oftentimes low-income people who are making those very, very inconvenient journeys. And the fair integration study that I was referring to really highlighted a lot of the equity benefits of these policies that were recommended. People with disabilities have a particularly challenged time using transit and are often also transit dependent. There's a whole other set of issues associated with paratransit. So there's a parallel transit system called paratransit that many people don't even have. You might see them on the road sometimes, but there's a whole other set of very similar issues in the fragmentation of those services that make getting around very, very difficult. That is another component, in terms of accessibility that we're working to try to build more, build into our policy recommendations, as well as align ourselves with groups that support that change and that can help speak up for themselves on these topics, and giving them the information that they need to know when is the right opportunity to speak up for these changes. Ultimately, I believe, and I think, transit should be for everybody. We shouldn't have we have very much a segregated transportation system right now, where we have some services that are very much oriented for low-income people and other services that are considered to be premium transit services that are faster and more reliable. That's reflected in the way we price our systems, and that's excluding people. So I think very broadly, the premise of integration is making transit just more equitable for everyone, giving access to everyone to some services that have historically been premium services. And ultimately, we all benefit when more people ride transit, no matter what income they are, because it's fewer people on the road, it's better air quality. So those are some of the ways we think about equity. But it's a constant project, and we're always learning more about how we can do our work in a way that is trying to be equitable.
Well, thank you. And I know we're getting close to when you need to leave us, but just in closing, two quick questions. We had a question about, is there a commuter train from Stockton to San Jose, which if you might happen to have that answer. And then secondly, was there anything at all in the state budget that was recently signed off on about operating funds for transit? Because we all know we're going to fall off a cliff when the federal funding from COVID relief wears out. So if you've got time, could you just answer those two questions?
Sure. There is already a train from Stockton to San Jose called the ACE train, and there are plans it's just 4 times a day. There are plans to increase it to 10 times a day. There's another project that's been talked about called Valley Link that would provide an all-day train that would go from the Dublin BART station over to Stockton. You'd still have to take BART the rest of the way. So yes, there's a few things going on, but yes, there is already a train, although it's only during commute times to Stockton. And it would benefit from integration with the rest of the system, I would say, to get to increase transit use.
Absolutely.
Because if you don't even know about it, then that's a problem. That means that maybe we should all put it on the map when we see any map of the system. To answer your second question, there really wasn't anything. There's been some more detail coming out about what are the different expenditure priorities like within the budget. There wasn't any high level pot of money for operations. There may be as we get more details, there may be the opportunity as we see some of the fine grained detail actually, sorry, I'm thinking about the federal budget where I've been getting more detail, and there may be the opportunity to fund aspects of integration, but the state budget, I'm pretty certain didn't have any funding for operations, unfortunately. So we'll keep trying, and maybe there's the opportunity for an allocation coming out associated with the SB 917 as it makes its way through appropriations. So we'll be trying our hardest to get funding for those things.
Okay, and it is at appropriations, Assembly appropriations on August 3rd, I believe.
Yes, we are expecting it to go to the suspense hearing. So August 3rd may not be that exciting of a meeting, but we'll keep you informed as to when the suspense hearing is, and which will be later in August. And
Thank you very much. Please
the pivotal
do.
moment.
Please do. And I know you have a hard stop. I'm going to turn it back to Carol now.
Thank you so much, Ian, for sharing your time and expertise today. And I love seeing this vision of the future, and I hope it comes to pass. As someone who uses a clipper card, like the clipper card to me was a great step forward. It just made it so much easier to take the casual trip, so that I really look forward to that. Also, I would like to send out the information on your last slide to everyone who registered, because we had a lot more people registered who were not able to come today. I think people are getting used to knowing that they can check in on the recording later. And so it's good and bad to be able to record. So if that's okay with you, I will send that to them along with the link to the video. So thank you so much. And I want everybody to note that we have a couple of upcoming Lunch with League programs. On Thursday, August the 18th, we will hear from Zulma Maciel, Director of the Office of Racial Equity for the City of San Jose. She's going to speak on building a welcoming San Jose through equity, inclusion, and belonging. And on Thursday, September 15th, we have a very special Lunch with League with Cameron Hickey of the Algorithmic Transparency Institute and the National Conference on Citizenship. And before you think this is going to be boring, it's not. He's going to speak on combating mis- and disinformation in your community. According to the people who attended National Convention, and Roma was one of those, he presented a dynamic workshop on this topic at that convention in June. And they thought it was one of the best, and that we are fortunate to have him commit his time in his very busy pre-election schedule, because of that during election is when, of course, mis and disinformation happens. So watch for more information about these and other upcoming events on our website and in our voter. So thank you so much for attending, everyone. Thanks to Roma. Thanks to Ian, and we'll talk later.